Hi again, everybody. Welcome to the Battle of Gettysburg Podcast with Jim Hessler. And I am joined today by an extra special guest. Many of you will know him from his work on the History Channel, from his videos with the American Battlefield Trust, just from seeing him on the battlefield as a Gettysburg licensed battlefield guide. And if any of you venture up to the War College, of course, I'm talking about none other than Doug Douds. Doug, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, good afternoon, Jim. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, in all transparency, Doug and I have known each other for a long time, but this is his first appearance on the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. Doug, you're super busy. Can't thank you enough for coming out to do this. This guy has one of the most impressive resumes you're ever going to come across in the history field. And I am going to read that resume because now more than ever, we need people with impressive backgrounds. And Doug, I think America needs more Doug Dowds. So let's do a little bit. Doug is a retired Marine colonel and faculty member at the U.S. Army War College, where he directs the Advanced Strategic Art program. Doug has served as a strategist and senior speechwriter for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Doug commanded a Marine FA-18 squadron in Iraq. As a pilot, he accrued over 3,000 flight hours, 340 aircraft carrier traps, and 135 combat missions. Yes, folks, Doug is a graduate of the Navy Fighter Weapons School. In other words, Top Gun to folks like you and me. Now, Doug's an avid learner. He's received not one, but two bachelor's of arts degrees in political science and history from Wake Forest University. He's got a master's from the Army War College, and most recently, Doug now holds a doctorate in military history from Leeds University, England. Doug, is there anywhere else you can go on the academic scale at this point?
I don't know. I keep hoping that I keep getting smarter at some point, and so I'm not sure where else to go. So I think this has led me to your podcast, maybe.
Oh, stop, stop. Well, our humble podcast here, Doug has appeared as a subject matter expert on the History Channel and on Netflix documentaries Grant, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, The Great War, FDR, D-Day, Churchill at War. I'm sure by the time this airs, there'll be three more things you've been involved with. But last and hopefully not least, Doug is also a licensed battlefield guide, and that's where our paths have crossed at Gettysburg, where he lives with his lovely wife. So, Doug, I'm exhausted just from thinking about your career.
Well, like I said, it's one of those things of you never stop learning. And I make the comment all the time, you go to breakfast with three licensed battlefield guides, and by the time you're done with breakfast, you're like, I'm a moron. I don't know anything. So there's always more.
So, what are we talking about today? I think we're going to do a little bit of staff work, right?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about staff work, and I would open it up to even be called almost like commanding machines. If you want to think about how Army leaders lead, there are the subordinate commanders, and that's who we normally think of, corps commanders, division commanders. But then there are the staff officers that round out kind of all the sinew that makes a staff work.
Is it because of your background? How did you specifically get interested in this topic from a Civil War perspective?
Yeah, I guess I think the dilemma is for anybody who serves long enough is eventually you'll end up on a staff. And we normally do the study of, hey, it's kind of a great leader. And then we study great leader decisions. And then we like the story of the frontline troops. But they're not that the leading commander never actually talks directly to that troops. There's all kind of connective tissue in there. And when you see what is required to move large organizations or get large organizations to carry out the will of the commander, and even just to do all the mundane tasks, for instance, the idea that we're moving 93,000 soldiers in the Army of Potomac across 10 counties and 3 states. How do you feed them, supply them, keep shoes on them? How do you make sure justice happens? How do you make sure we clean up the dead and the wounded? All of those jobs belong to someone.
Mhm.
And in that sense, it's rarely studied, in part because staff work tends to be boring and it's not a great commander and it's not frontline action, but it is nonetheless activities that have to be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit it on the head. I hate to say easily, but we so easily gravitate to the combat, right? And we're talking about the fighting, the fighting, the fighting. While I've seen logistics maybe getting more respect from people in recent years, to your point, I don't know that everything that goes into actual staff and command at headquarters, whether it's Army headquarters or at the lower level, I don't know that that has really gotten the deep dives. So, let's do it today. And, nobody better than you to kind of educate everybody on how it worked. So, Battle of Gettysburg, because this is the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. You've got wherever you want to start, Army of the Potomac, Army of Northern Virginia. Just sort of walk us through what's the staff situation coming into Gettysburg in each one of the armies.
But it's interesting, right? Because the Army of the Potomac, I would argue that they made the same response institutionally that like Prussia makes in 1806. Prussia has, what do you do when Napoleon shows up at your border and you don't have a Frederick the Great? Well, first of all, you get creamed. And then they go, we're never going to let this happen again. And so then they develop the German general staff that we should have this expertise that sits just below a commander. And if those guys are really good, then even if we have an average guy, he might achieve some degree of genius. The Army of the Potomac staff is really developed because Lincoln gets to pick the commander, but every time they lose or tie and get a new one, what they're doing is each one of those commanders tends to bring a guy or find a guy to fill a position. And once the right person is in a staff position, they tend to remain. So we normally think of George Gordon Meade gets command of the Army of the Potomac 3 days before they battle. Got it. But what he inherits is an utterly professional staff. And when you start to look across it, it's almost as if every guy is the best guy in that. Seth Williams is the best adjutant general. Henry Clark's the best commissariat. Rufus Ingalls the best quartermaster. Henry Hunt's the best artillerist. Meade inherits all of those, and it ends up almost being the collective genius of the Army of the Potomac against the individual genius of Robert E. Lee.
Okay. All right. So sticking with the Army of the Potomac for a minute then. When we talk about staff, how many guys are we talking about? And how many functions does this cross?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and we were talking about this. I've tried to go back and look at the numbers, and I don't have a good one for you.
That's
I'll
okay.
throw some things at you, but if we think about this, it really goes at the national level. So at the national level, you have bureaus, 9 bureaus, and they're most of the ones we talked about: adjutant general, judge advocate general, ordnance, quartermaster, artillery, cavalry, signal corps, and they are helping support armies in the field. So the representatives on a staff are really kind of extensions of that Washington, D.C. level staff. And then there are also some extras thrown in there. We think about paymasters, provost marshals, those also have bureaus. So it is an extension of that national level staff that enables an army to go. And in turn, those trickle down to corps, divisions, brigades, and even regiments. But when you get to a regiment, instead of it being a lieutenant colonel, it's a sergeant that's the commissary officer or commissary officer.
Okay. All right. And you talked about the changeover in the command, Hooker to Meade on the eve of the Gettysburg campaign. It's always sort of portrayed, at least in a lot of quarters it is, with one notable exception, Chief of Staff Dan Butterfield. We often sort of have this impression that Meade's staff is entirely new. We know his son, Captain George Meade. We talk about him a lot, but is Meade bringing in a lot of his own guys with him besides his son, or
Yeah, this
is he
is
still
a great
inheriting?
question. So
Yeah.
this cuts both ways. When he leaves the Fifth Corps, he brings 5 personal aides with him, his
Okay.
son being one, the most famous of them. He inherits 7 Army level aides that were actually Hooker guys. But
Okay.
some of them had been aides. Lieutenant Rosencrantz has been an aide for almost every Army of the Potomac commander. So he inherits 7 guys that are used to operating at that level. And you go, well, does he bring the Fifth Corps staff with him? No, because George Sykes has to go fight the Fifth Corps. So
Right.
Sykes inherits a Fifth Corps staff. So in the end, he doesn't bring that many people with him.
The one exception that I did note was Dan Butterfield, of course. He inherits Chief of Staff Dan Butterfield. Now, I recently had James Pula here on the podcast, who's recently done a bio of Dan Butterfield. Dr. Jim's book is very favorable to Butterfield, and I think feels like Butterfield hasn't gotten his due within the Army of the Potomac. What's your take? Does Butterfield, as chief of staff, being inherited, does he serve Meade well during the Gettysburg campaign, or does he do him dirty a little bit? What do you think?
Yeah, so this is a balanced record. It's a little bit like when Hooker gets command of the army and everybody goes, oh, fighting Joe Hooker. And then what they're really surprised is that he can administer and run an army.
Yes.
He feeds it, he pays it, they get in better health, he helps restore the leave system and the parole system. All that gets squared away. But the guy who helps him do that, Dan Butterfield. I mean, those orders are all going through him. And if you think about it, he goes from a militia first sergeant up to a major general, which is pretty heady. But when Meade inherits command of the Army of the Potomac, for everybody that he wants to replace him with, almost all of them say, look, he kind of knows where all the pieces are.
Right.
And that's why Meade, I think, keeps him in place. Is he worried about him? Yes. And if we look at the, testimony before the Joint Committee of the Conduct after the war, he should have been worried about
Right.
him. But nonetheless, the guy is competent as a chief of staff.
So how about elsewhere within the Army? Anybody else you want to talk about specifically?
Well, so you bring up a point of the idea of when Meade takes over, what changes does he make? And we
Yeah.
know he tries to change out Butterfield with Warren and Humphreys and Seth. Like he asks a bunch of people to do it, they all turn him down. But I would suggest he makes a really subtle change in the staff. The cavalry chief and the chief of artillery are, according to order, they are administrative positions. They're staff officers. However, they can have command responsibilities depending upon the commanding general's responsibilities given them. I would argue that Meade takes Henry Hunt and operationalizes him and makes him a commander, and he de-operationalizes Alfred Pleasanton
Okay.
because Union cavalry hadn't been nearly as aggressive as they need to be, and it's the only branch that Meade has never been in is the cavalry. So now, if he puts Alfred Pleasanton's tent right next to his, that just empowered a bunch of really good division commanders, David McMurtry Gregg, John Buford. So now that information comes directly to the tent right next to his. It's a subtle change, but I think it will yield multitudes of dividends throughout the rest of the campaign.
Okay, so great points. So on the cavalry side, you then kind of subscribe to the notion that really Pleasanton is, again, acting under Meade's wing next to headquarters, and that it really is the division commanders getting the job done.
Yeah, and I wasn't convinced of this until finally I read Phil Sheridan's account of them in the Wilderness Campaign, where he's complaining to Grant that the chief of cavalry in the Army of the Potomac is an administrative staff position. And the answer is yes. That's exactly how George Gordon Meade intended it to be.
Okay, all right. And then, of course, Grant obviously gets
Yeah, that
decides
doesn't
like,
last long.
yeah, let Sheridan loose. But that's a podcast. That's for the Overland podcast. We'll stick to
Okay.
the Gettysburg podcast. All right, then. How about on the artillery side? So you mentioned Henry Hunt. Just talk, if you could, talk a little bit more about how his role does or doesn't change.
There's a transition in there where Hunt is really kind of operationalized under McClellan, and it stays that way until Hooker takes over, and then he basically sheds a lot of the artillery out of the artillery reserves, and he brings them back into the headquarters. After Chancellorsville, Hooker like, boy, that was a terrible idea, but it is never stated, and even Meade never officially states it. However, if you read Hunt's testimony before the joint conduct of the war, he said, by the assignments Meade was giving me, I assumed that he wanted me to effectively be operationalized, and I think that's true.
Okay, all right. So since you brought up the topic of Hunt being operationalized, we'll jump ahead to July 3rd for a moment. Hunt versus Hancock. Who, in your view, is right?
Actually, so this one I really do struggle with. For a Hunt, the idea of an attack coming across is I kind of characterize it as science command. You well know we call it Pickett's charge, but let's face it, they march across the field. So in my mind, that's a 28-inch steps. It's 110 steps a minute from the far tree line to the copse of trees, roughly 16 to 18 minutes. If you're Henry Hunt, well, that's 4 rounds of solid, 4 rounds of shell, 4 rounds of case, and about 6 rounds of canister. It's a math problem. For Winfield Scott Hancock, he goes, infantry is the decisive arm in the Civil War. My 6,000 infantrymen will determine whether we hold or not. So that artillery theory is mildly interesting. And while they're getting pounded by 300 shells a minute, the only thing they take any perverse joy in is the fact that somebody else is getting pounded too, which is kind of the art of command. He's playing in the moral sphere. So you almost have the science and the art of command in two different bodies.
Mhm.
And that's what's playing out. They both have a merit to their case. And
Right.
certainly Meade would agree with Hunt that they should have stopped firing. But you can't deny that Hancock actually knows the score. Infantry's the most decisive arm, and maintaining their morale before that line crosses that field is important.
The fact that they both kind of have an argument in their corner is why we're still arguing about it 160 years later, right? And you
Yeah,
can
which is
get,
which I confess makes mine a bit of a non-answer. I can see
no,
both cases.
yeah, yeah. To me, the interesting part of that was always going into the correspondence afterward when they're kind of going back and forth with guys like John Batchelder, and you see Hancock specifically refer to Hunt at one point as basically a staff officer to the effect of, I was entrusted with the whole left wing of the Army of the Potomac, and I was not going to listen to some staff officer, right? You see him basically refer to that.
Yeah, so this literally goes back to the first part of our conversation. If Hunt thinks that he's been operationalized, then he has the authority to employ artillery as if all the artillery was his. So hence he has the authority. Hunt goes, "Hey, you're an Army of the Potomac staff guy. You have no authority on my line." And so you can see now this is literally a clash of authorities. And when we're talking about command, that means everything.
So George Meade takes command of the Army of the Potomac, sort of in this period, June 28th to June 30th. You've already talked about Pleasanton. We've already talked about Hunt, a little bit about Butterfield. Do you see other things going on in the Army of the Potomac that Meade is kind of putting his stamp on?
Yeah, so other than he empowers his staff to go ahead and act, this is where we see all those things about, even on the 28th, Rufus Ingalls starts to order 10,000 shoes and 10,000 booties. All of this is staff officers anticipating the needs of the Army, which is really to take all the mundane tasks off the plate of the commander. George Gordon Meade never really has to look behind him. He concentrates constantly on how do I fight Robert E. Lee. Um, Henry Clark will have on the 28th, will move 300,000 rations to Union Bridge. He's anticipating that as they move north, they're going to need those. None of those are decisions Meade has to make. So I think mostly he's thinking about how do I get the Army, get them back together? How do I get them moving north and increase the speed at which they operate?
Shifting gears, how might then we transfer and compare that to the Army of Northern Virginia? What's going on with Robert E. Lee?
Yeah, so Robert E. Lee, from the day he takes over, even after his first battle out on the peninsula, he recognizes he has staff problems. However, on the Army of Northern Virginia side, there is never really uh, the definitive act or there's never a failure enough to say you should take time to fix that because Lee always has something else more pressing to fix. All right, he has to rearrange his army on the way up to Second Bull Run. He's going to rearrange his artillery as he goes into Antietam and to Fredericksburg. He's got to rearrange his army as he goes from Chancellorsville to Gettysburg. There's always something more pressing. And oh, by the way, because he wins, it's always relative. I mean, it isn't great staff work, but it's not that
Mhm.
bad because we keep on winning. So I think he never really has the impetus to change how his staff is arranged.
Talked about Meade basically just being able to focus on the enemy because he has such a good background apparatus doing the logistical work for him. Does Lee have that same advantage, or is Lee thinking about supplies and other things that maybe Meade doesn't have to focus as much on?
Yeah, I would argue Lee does not have the same. This isn't to say that all that most of the same structure exists in the same way the Confederacy they just take the bureau system that's in DC and they plop it in Virginia. But even the bureau system in Richmond, those people aren't as good as the people in Washington D.C. And oh, by the way, Lee is loath to keep real talent on his staff. I mean, we think about Henry Hunt, like, man, he would be a good corps commander or a good corps artillery guy if we really want him to command. Lee is loath to keep talent on his staff because as he says to John Bell Hood, if only the Army could be properly organized and officered. So they're running out of guys. Plus, he doesn't want to set a bad example of having a huge staff with a large entourage, lest every other Confederate general do the same. So
Okay.
he is trying to keep it small, and it's small by design. So he has really six major people that are with him all the time, and everybody else are kind of adjuncts. And the Army of Northern Virginia operates with a fair amount of ad hocery at any one time.
Right. Okay. You might have just answered what I think might be one of the most important questions of the day, because one of the cliches we always say at Gettysburg when trying to explain why did Lee allow this or that to happen in the Army of Northern Virginia, and very often we will say, oh, well, because his staff was too small. And one of the questions I was going to hit you with was, why did Lee allow that to be the case? And I think you've just answered that, but is there anything else you want to kind of add to it?
No, I think those are the two things. One, he was loath to set a bad precedent, and two, at this point, certainly in the war, they're running out of good leaders. And we even see in 64 where he starts to peel guys off his staff to go do what are command-like functions. So I think he is a little bit stuck in where he is. And again, he really hasn't paid the penalty for bad staff work.
How about at the lower level, which you started to touch on in your opening answer? Sticking with the Army of Northern Virginia for a minute, one of the things you often hear said about James Longstreet, for example, at the First Corps level, is what a great user of his staff he was. Do you have any opinions really on any of them? Longstreet, Ewell Hill, do you have any opinions on any of them?
Yeah, supposedly Longstreet's almost by universal agreement, he has the best Corps staff that exists. Now, granted, his Corps has been together for a long time, so he has that, those relationships of trust built throughout it. But also the guys that are there are pretty talented. Moxley Sorrell's a pretty talented guy. Even when you start to look at his chief of artillery and those kind of positions, they're actually solid. He gets along with his staff. He lives with his staff. He's serious and he jokes around with his staff. I think that helps build that degree of trust. Lee's staff is a little different in the sense that his 6 general staff officers are around him all the time, but most of the rest of it isn't. We have the snapshot on the march up to Gettysburg, where the 6th Corps quartermaster talks about the Army of the Potomac staff is the size of a small town.
Right.
Because all those guys are around George Gordon Meade.
Yeah. Yeah.
However, we also have this snapshot from Fitzgerald Ross when he comes across Lee's headquarters in Messerschmitt's Woods, and he talks about it's a half dozen tents and about a half dozen baggage wagons, because the only people that are around Lee are basically his 6 regulars, but like his quartermaster, his commissary, his ordnance officer, those guys do not hang out at Lee's headquarters. Presumably you go, wow, that's a different way to approach it. They're off doing the job. But on the other hand, every time Meade gets hang on, what's that issue? Oh, it's an ordnance issue. He could turn to Captain Flagler and go, you take care of that.
Mm-hmm.
Every time Meade gets one of them, he's got to be like, hang on, put it on the to-do list the next time we see that guy. So it's a different structure and process to employ the staff than the Army of Potomac has.
If you could go back to the Army of Northern Virginia, if you were Robert E. Lee, or if there's one change you could make to the Army of Northern Virginia staff, what would you do?
Uh, 2 thoughts on that. I would have a legitimate chief of staff. I
Okay.
know we often talk about Chilton as a chief of staff, but look at all the things we have Butterfield doing, whether it's writing up the Pipe Creek order or going with Meade to Hancock to say go up to Gettysburg. The staff runs through the chief of staff, a novel position in the American Civil War, by the way. We've never had one of those before. Lee could use one of those. The other person that he probably should have had was somebody from the cavalry in his staff.
Okay.
Doesn't. And so when we often talk about this idea of Jeb Stuart not being there, well, nobody is there then to work a cavalry issue, which is really an intelligence issue. If nobody's going to come up with a notional or a creative solution, it would have to be Robert E. Lee. Otherwise, nobody's thinking about that. And so because he doesn't have that expertise, someone to handle that task or to come up with a creative solution. Because I mean, we think about this stuff all the time, like, hey, why don't you just dismount a battery and
Right.
give yourself 100 riders? At least do that. But that doesn't happen. So I think he would have been well served had he had another expert in his headquarters, in particular, because we know how the cavalry situation turns out at Gettysburg.
Okay, interesting. I thought maybe how about Pendleton with the artillery? I thought maybe
Yeah.
you would go there. Any thoughts on old Granny?
Yeah, well, the Confederates know this is a problem, of course, right? He's like having an elephant. We have him. We don't know what to do. It costs the devil to feed him and all that.
Yeah.
I mean, Lee knows he's a weak link. And so when he reorganizes artillery and now he pushes it all down to division level, seemingly this eliminates the Pendleton problem, but then it's going to give us problem that you're well familiar with. When we get to Pickett's charge and now we need to coordinate multiple corps worth of artillery, who does that fall to, especially if he's not going to step into that role?
Right.
Then it falls to Lee to coordinate.
Back to the Army of the Potomac. You mentioned something in a answer a few moments ago about Pipe Creek. Um, First of all, maybe just sort of at a general level. Look, my position is we spend way too much time talking about Pipe Creek, given what role it did or didn't play during the battle. But nevertheless, it dominates a lot of the early battle historiography. So, from Meade's staff perspective, who plays sort of an important part in developing that, and what do they do?
Well, so I would use Pipe Creek as evidence that Meade really only has to think about fighting Robert E. Lee because
Yeah.
effectively it's a contingency plan, or we call
Mhm.
it the range plan today. But it's not the only one, right? Humphreys is over at Emmitsburg looking at lines. Even when Reynolds is up at Marsh Creek, he's looking at lines. These are all just in case this all goes back. It's the most formal one. Um, Preparation, as you well know, sending Hunt out there to look at the line. He sends Warren out there to look at the line, and you might know better. There are accounts that Meade spends the morning or part of the morning on July 1st out there looking at parts of that line too. So it is a contingency plan in light of Meade trying to figure out how do we anticipate when we run into Robert E. Lee, what are our options?
Okay. And I know related to that, a staff officer that I think you have an interest in, correct me if I'm wrong, Joseph Dickinson.
Yeah, so this gets to be the discussion about what does well I like that you started off with we spent too much time on Pipe Creek, and then we spend too much time on, you know, what does Reynolds know? Does he know it's there or not?
Hey,
So
hey, hey, I have a whole PowerPoint presentation on that. So go easy on too much time. But no, I get your point. You're 100% right.
but I think what I at least take out of this is Dickinson has been at headquarters all day. He's been there on the 29th and 30th. He's the senior aide. So that's one of those guys he inherited, Lieutenant Colonel. Um, when he goes forward and he spends 20 minutes with Reynolds, I think he goes, here's everything that's going on down there. Like he just gives him global situational awareness. Here's where all the other corps is. Hey, by the way, we're looking at a line back there. And if nothing else, Reynolds is at least aware of it. And to me, then that kind of pulls some of that debate off. Then he goes forward to Beaufort, which I think is interesting, spends 2 hours with him, and then comes back with the latest and greatest information. He's supposed to um, go back through First Corps headquarters, but in order to make time, because it's late, he takes a different road, but he does travel with the aide that Beaufort sends to get to where the roads divide at Tawnytown and Baltimore, which I think is good staff work,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Lieutenant Colonel in the middle of the night taking some knucklehead on a dark road. You've never been down here, but here, this road, don't leave this road. You'll eventually get to a
yeah.
tavern. That's where I think that's good staff work.
Okay, great. So, yeah, I mean, you see these social media debates that are so elaborate. Dickinson is up in Gettysburg telling Buford on the evening of June 30th about the Pipe Creek Circular. I don't see it. B, it doesn't jive with the timing of when Meade decides to draft the Pipe Creek Circular. And C, even if you want to believe Dickinson has all this stuff in his head, even if you want to believe that, there's nothing in the historical record that I'm aware of to support it.
Yeah, again, and even by his own account, it's 20 minutes.
Yeah.
It's 20 minutes. I mean, then that's gets off your horse. Hey, how you doing? Yeah, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's all the formalities. Throw those out of the way. And I agree with you. I don't think he says that Meade's wants to fight there in any way. I think he just gives him, here's what's going on. There's a
Yeah.
line back there. It's one more way that I think Meade is comfortable with Reynolds having the judgment to make the calls up front.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, fair enough. So should we get to finally July 1st?
Sure.
Let's start shooting. Where do we want to go from here? The battle is underway at Gettysburg. Do you want to give us some examples on the battlefield or maybe still back at Army headquarters? What
Yeah,
do you
well,
want to do?
so there, I mean, obviously there's a lot going on up front, but like one of the ones I like is just the idea of aide de camps
Okay.
are part of staffs. They really belong to the commander, as much a personal guy as any. They have little rank, but they carry the authority of the commander. So one of your guys that you're familiar with is Henry Tremaine, Sickles senior aide. He gives us the best example as he's riding with Reynolds into town. And then finally, Reynolds gets a break and he goes, hey, what should the Third Corps do? And he goes, you should tell General Sickles, I think he should come forward.
Yeah.
And he has a wonderful line in his account that says, it is amazing how much horse flesh is wasted by aides riding around looking for commanders. And it's a really subtle, small line, but it does get to the idea of we lose sight of these massive armies traveling on roads that are not mapped, that are on the move, and how much time and effort it took for these guys to be able to deliver something as simple as a message of you should come forward.
Yeah. And great example, and how often we're dealing with groups on the battlefield where you've got to consistently remind people these guys did not have instantaneous communications, right? So, well, why didn't they do this or do that? Because in some cases, you're waiting hours to hear from headquarters, right?
Yep. Yep. So I find that to be a really interesting story. And of course, it'll play out for the rest of the time. Stephen Weld, one of Reynolds' aides that goes back and tells Meade he's going to fight at about, gets there about 11:20 or 11:30, depending on what count you want to read. So now Meade knows there's a battle going on. There's an interesting point in there, even about About the time it takes, I just think about this as efficiency and staff work. So Meade gets word 11:30 that the fight is taking place. So now how long does it take for the rest of the staff to learn what the boss knows? So by 12:30, that's when Henry Clark pushes 300,000 rations to Union Bridge. Because in his mind, he goes, this is going to happen. Boss hasn't said it, but this is my first rodeo. In fact, it's his fourth campaign with the Army of the Potomac. So he knows how rations work. And so he totally leans in. Again, another decision Meade doesn't have to make. This is really starting to shift the supply base up to Westminster and Union Bridge. It's good staff work.
Yeah, it's a great point. And conversely, what's going on in headquarters of the Army of Northern Virginia on this day?
Oh yeah, so we have kind of have another one of those counter examples. Like we talk about, Lee starts the day with Longstreet, and he's riding forward, and then we have it's a one-liner, and it says, "I spent about an hour trying to untangle Ewell's reserve supply trains on the Chambersburg Pike."
Yeah.
Why is the Army of Northern Virginia commander untangling wagon trains? This is a quartermaster issue. This is a provost marshal issue. This is a lot of other people's responsibility, but it isn't Robert E. Lee's responsibility, especially knowing that the 30th largest battle of the Civil War is going on right now.
Yeah.
It knocks your socks off.
And then you have going back to the aide-de-camp and the couriers and the messengers, everything then going back and forth to Ewell and Hill at this point. Don't bring on a general engagement, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, so we end up a little of this to me gets into all of this system is designed to help a commander make better decisions. So presumably, even when we get to the point that Ewell is considering, take the high ground if practicable and all that, and he writes to Hill to say, hey, what if you use your artillery? And Hill's like, yeah, no. And Lee lets him send it mostly because of his larger command philosophy, put my troops in position, and then it's up to my commanders in the providence of God to deliver victory. He's loath to step on the toes of a new corps commander that he needs to act independently when he's not looking over his shoulder. However, I would argue that a commander has the prerogative to override his subordinates in name of the common good, or to achieve that coordination that ultimately the Army of Northern Virginia just doesn't seem to be able to pull off at Gettysburg. And then like another small one would be, and there's really, again, it's just a simple one-liner. We know Meade is upset that the Pipe Creek order hadn't gone out.
Yeah.
But then when he learns that Reynolds has been dead at 1 o'clock, he rides to Hancock's headquarters, because remember, he had already given him a half-hour brain dump of like, here's everything I know. So at least he has situational awareness. But he still takes Butterfield with him, even though he's mad at him. And Meade goes, go up there, tell me if it's a good place to have a battle, all that. But if you're Hancock, like one thing Hancock knows how to do is fight.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a line in there where Butterfield says, remember, when Slocum shows up, turn the field over to Slocum. You must come back and tell us if that's a good. He reminds him of your job. I know you know how to fight. This job isn't to go up there and fight. Your job is to go up there and be a directed telescope to let Meade know it's a really subtle catch, because it's not in Meade's directions. That's why he has to specifically say it. And again, I think it's a really subtle piece of nice staff work.
Good. Excellent. How about as we pivot into July 2nd? Obviously the Meade Sickles scenario. What could we have done better with staff work there?
Yeah, so I think this one's on Meade a bit, because when he does send his aide, he sends his son. He knows they don't really get along. I think this would have been one of those cases of send any one of those other 7 guys that had been an Army of the Potomac aide. Don't go down there and poke him in the chest. We literally need to get this squared away. I think this introduces a personal, emotional aspect to this that doesn't have to be there. So I think early on, part of this blame is Meade's.
Very often having that conversation with military people, they'll say, damn it, Jim, how hard is it to follow orders? But there's a human dynamic here that you have to factor into it.
Yeah, and I think Meade could have controlled it. Obviously, we just got done talking about Joseph Dickinson. Like, hey, send in your senior guy. Hey, go down there, unruffle his feathers, just find out where he is, get him in position. And moreover, that his son went down there. And when Sickles is like, hey, I'm not exactly sure where I'm supposed to be. Remember, his son's new to being an aide. An aide should know, have greater situational awareness about where everybody should be. And so that when Sickles goes, hey, I'm not sure, or his if it's not Sickles, it's Tremaine or one of those guys says, hey, we're still figuring this out. A good aide would have said, okay, here's where everybody else is. Here's where you guys should be. But he's not. And because he doesn't know how to be a good aide, bad staff work. Now he's got to go ride back to headquarters. This all takes more time. And ultimately, this is going to come back and bite them all.
Anything else on the Sickles side that you would add before we move on?
Well, there is this aspect of Meade's trying to use and Sickles is tapping into what is one of the things staffs do is provide expertise. When Meade sends Hunt out with Sickles to look at how to place his artillery, that is an effort to try and tap into a larger set of expertise than necessarily exists at a corps level or at the level that certainly Sickles wanted to have that conversation with. So there is efforts to try and get that going.
Okay. And by the way, since all the hate mail will be directed to the Battle of Gettysburg podcast, folks, relax. We're not making excuses for Sickles. We're just saying the situation is more professionally complicated and nuanced than it's often portrayed to be, right?
Yeah. Like I said, like all great things, there's, in great disasters, there's plenty of blame to go around.
Yeah.
Buford shouldn't move off of the peach orchard without being replaced. Like there's a pile of other things to talk about here, but this is just one of those exacerbating factors within this larger narrative.
Yeah. And today's edition of the Dan Sickles Report. Congratulations, Doug. You did a Dan Sickles report on your first Battle of Gettysburg podcast appearance. Add that to your mighty impressive resume. Just sort of add that.
We were talking about July 2nd. If we want to take two real quick shots at Meade riding his lines when he gets there.
Okay.
With Hunt, Howard, and William Payne, and Payne draws the map. Now, Meade doesn't know, hey, 40% of people out there are oral learners, 40% are visual learners, but he does know that as units arrive on the field, he's got to bring them up to speed, kind of develop a common operational picture, and a map would go a long way. So like William Payne being able to draw a map on the pommel of his horse in the dark or in the pre-dawn or whatever that is like special staff work. That guy is good at that. And that really matters because when units arrive on the field, now they're going to start to take their positions. It's another way of kind of staff work and Meade anticipating what am I going to need if I'm going to go ahead and try and make this battle go the way I intended. And then the other one, of course, would be the ghost train. Ghost train.
Yeah, talk about that for people who might not be as familiar with it.
So there's a big problem at the end of day one. The 1st Corps and the 11th Corps in particular heavily engaged in July 1st. Their trains had remained back, I believe, around Emmitsburg. And so they're not on the field. So when when the Union Army retreats from back north and west of town into what we know is the fishhook shaped line, their artillery is terribly low on ammunition. Meade is concerned about this, but Henry Hunt, obviously not the first time an Army commander has sought his advice about how do I resupply artillery. Back in 1862, with the help of the quartermaster, squirreled away another 40 wagons so that basically he stuffed 20 extra rounds of ammunition per cannon in the Army of the Potomac. So when Meade goes, hey, what are we going to do about that? Henry Hunt's able to go, I got it. Again, he takes this task off of Meade's plate. We now have 2 corps worth of artillery back in the game because of inherently good staff work. This took planning from a long time ago, and why it really matters, the average corps commander in the Army of the Potomac has less than a campaign experience, I guess.
Right, at that level, yeah.
But his average staff officer has almost 3 campaigns worth. They've seen things from other campaigns that now they're able to anticipate, and this is one of the best examples.
Anything else July 2nd in the Army of the Potomac you can think of before we shift to the other side of the field?
Yeah, there are, there's a couple of one. He's going to send Warren over to check Slocum's homework about can they attack on the right. And then there's a pile of circulars that get put out there, and you can kind of riffle through them and go, he's just sweating it. But if you look at them, they're all map your position. They establish a contact from a corps to the Army of the Potomac headquarters, and he assigns one of his Army of the Potomac staff officers to the corps. And effectively, what he's trying to do is speed his decision cycle by going, you guys need to figure out how to get back and forth between those 2 places quickly. So it's not needed right now, but he's anticipating that when you fight Robert E. Lee, he's going to have a very rapid decision cycle. Their army moves really quick. We need to make sure we have that in place. So those circulars are his efforts to try and get at that, and that's staff work because it's Seth Williams and the boys genning those things up and sending them out.
I'm glad you mentioned that, the idea of basically one staff level contact per corps. Because, I've seen the circular, but have never really seen examples of that in the historical record of how that actually got used during the battle. Certainly, a direct connection between Sickles and Meade would have saved a lot of heartache. But do you know of any examples where something really came in? Or, did Hancock have a contact when he saw Sickles moving forward? He could have sent his guy to headquarters.
Man, this is it's a great question because that is the stump the chumper. Even by the end of the day, when Meade watches the first Minnesota go in and his line's falling apart, and now he goes to send somebody to the first corps. Well, he's supposed to have a guy.
Yeah.
It's tied to the first corps. In the end, he sends Tidball, cavalry battalion commander, who I don't know why he's on that side of the field. Says he has no responsibilities, but it is again Union Army of the Potomac ad hocery. When even though they made all those assignments, I know of no case where they actually used the guy assigned to deliver any of those messages.
Okay, good. Well, I was hoping you would solve a mystery for me there because I'm aware of that relationship, but I've never seen it either. So I
Yeah, that
guess
one
if they
hurt.
had a good connection between Meade and Sickles, I would be looking for a new career. So maybe it all worked out for the best. I don't know. All right. How about Army of Northern Virginia? There's got to be a lot of ad hocery, as you like to call it, going on there on July 2nd. I can think of one with Longstreet's countermarch right off the top of my head, but anything that comes to your mind?
Yeah, so we'll even go before that because Samuel Johnson going down to do
Mhm.
reconnaissance, no cav, nobody to work the cav intel issue. So Lee is now back to, back when I was with Winfield Scott, I did all the recon. I'm going to tap into my engineer. Now he's done this before. Samuel Johnson did other reconnaissance. In fact, he uses them at Chancellorsville quite a bit. So he's good at it. But what you see is now an engineer filling what is a cav role. That's not new. The problem gets to what you just suggest is now that he gets back and delivers the message, it would be a cavalry responsibility to monitor. Hey, there's nobody down on that high ground. The line still ends where it ends. So now we do march, countermarch. And when Longstreet comes out of the woods at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and goes, hey, wait, Union Army's 500 yards away. Well, yeah, because nobody's been watching that for the
Right.
last 8 hours. That's a cavalry's responsibility. That's the breakdown of staff work.
Is there anything we could or should hold Longstreet accountable for on that? With
Well,
this,
there is
again, he's the king of using his staff, as they like to tell us. Anything he could have done, maybe?
Well, we end up with this really odd scenario where because Lee talks directly to McLaws, Longstreet says, I don't have control of him. But technically, staff officers should have been all along the route that they marched to get down there. There should have never been a march and a countermarch. That should have never happened. And even Edward Porter Alexander would say that was a breakdown in staff work. He literally says, we don't have enough staff officers at the Army of Northern Virginia level. So he calls it what it is. He's not wrong. But it's because Longstreet's kind of bunged up about the McLaws thing that this even happens that way. Arthur Fremantle talks about that afternoon. He's down with Colonel Peyton Manning, Longstreet's ordnance chief, and Major Thomas Walton, I think is
Okay.
his adjutant general. They're down on the southern end of Seminary Ridge, picking cherries and bathing in a creek, and they're so close to the Union Cav lines that the whole thing was uncomfortable. Wait a minute, what? While Longstreet's making his flank march and counter marching, you guys are taking a bath and eating cherries? Like
Right.
that's horrifically bad staff work.
Right. Right. A Fremantle scene that did not make it into the movie Gettysburg, amazingly, right?
So true. So look, I mean, we can look back and cherry pick this thing, and even in retrospect, here's what they could do. But in light of not having cavalry, everybody should have been thinking about what is a workaround to solve that problem, and they really aren't.
Hmm. Have you looked at the issue in your studies at all as far as where the hell is Robert E. Lee during that portion of July 2nd? There's the debate about the traditional version being he went up to the seminary and sat there all day, but that's actually not true. We have 7 or 8 guys who can place him somewhere down on the south end of the battlefield in the early part of the afternoon. Related to this idea of is Lee doing things himself, do you have any skin in that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I think we struggle with this one. I don't have a problem with where Lee is on July 2nd because right now Like it hadn't gone bad, right? We
Yeah.
come up with a plan. Here's how it should coordinate. We've done that before on other battlefields. This should work. It's when we get to the end of things like late afternoon of July 2nd, where's Robert E. Lee? Or even when you start talking about, hey, we are unable to achieve this proper concert of action. He's the proper concert of action guy. Then I think he becomes way more responsible.
So, so then, kind of in the interest of time, though, I don't want to short shrift Ewell, Early, any of these guys.
Yeah,
Anything on that end of the field?
yeah, of course. So, first of all, we have the back and forth. I'm okay
Hmm.
with move them around, don't move them around. These are just good exchanges that should inform a commander's decision. But the inability of Ewell to coordinate Johnson and Early, inability of Early and Rhodes to be coordinated, that is all poor staff work.
Okay,
And
great.
technically speaking, that's Stonewall Jackson's staff. They should have been able to pull that off. And they're all relatively experienced commanders, with the exception of, I guess we could poke holes at Rhodes maybe, but it's not talking about a major part of, it's not a big part of the field. It's not geographically separated very much. That should have been way more coordinated. But even one corps seems unable to go ahead and coordinate its activities on July 2nd.
Well, you bring up a great point about them all being Jackson guys. One of the things we talk about with Longstreet staffers is supposedly they have the ability to take the initiative. Sometimes with Jackson's guys at Gettysburg, you get a feeling that they're just kind of sitting around looking at you all going, okay, what would Jackson do? As opposed to taking that initiative and doing it themselves, right?
Yeah, yeah. So that part I think goes down at, we were talking, hey, at the Army level, but if we look at a corps level, I think that is also a breakdown of staff work.
Interest of time, let's move to July 3rd.
Yeah, yeah. So you got to start with July 3rd, Council of War on the Army of the Potomac side, massive staff work, common operational picture, the BMI. We've accounted for every unit in Lee's army except for Pickett. That's good operational intelligence. That Captain Dahlgren shows up at midnight and says there will be no army of effigy. That's operational level rather than tactical level intelligence. Good staff work. There's goodness all on the Union side. And of course, Lee doesn't meet with, never meets with all of his corps commanders altogether. So he puts a premium on staff work when the structure and the processes don't exist.
Okay. And you brought up the BMI, which is something we have not talked about. Just in your opinion, how valuable are they to what Meade is doing here, and how much do you think Meade is or isn't relying on them? Because you have books that can argue one extreme or the other.
Yeah, so I think here's a case of a truly independent structure for which the Army of Potomac reaps an advantage for which there is no equivalent on the Confederate side. So now, for the first time, an Army commander is not its own operational officer and intelligence officer. Somebody is now taking inputs, newspapers, spies, interrogating prisoners, and coming up with analysis. So again, now Meade can free up part of his brain housing group to think about how to fight Robert E. Lee, because I got somebody else working that problem. So
Hmm.
I see it as an advantage. And if nothing else, it's situational awareness for Meade that would be really good information to have.
And then, so then back to Lee, going back then to the planning of July 3rd, like you said, he doesn't meet with any of his corps commanders. What is Army of Northern Virginia headquarters doing to prep for the day?
Yeah, so it's terrible. Effectively, what we have is, even the backside of the Council of War notes, we have that, back of the envelope math that says 58,000. So at least the Army of Potomac goes, well, to the nearest thousand-ish. Here's what we think we have. Lee has none of that. He really doesn't have the staff structure to do it. And even some of the normative behaviors that we see in the Army of Northern Virginia, like post Antietam, when all the wing commanders and the division commanders show up at Lee's headquarters to kind of give them, hey, how's your division doing? That doesn't happen. In fact, we know, at 1 o'clock in the morning, he's talking about, I need a guide on how do I get across the Potomac River. And the first guy shows up knows about the Rappahannock River. You're like, wait a minute, that's definitely a cavalry problem. That's probably a provost marshal problem. That's probably an engineer problem. It might be a quartermaster problem, but it isn't a Robert E. Lee problem, not at 1 o'clock in the morning on July 3rd. So it's a case of he is literally doing any other job than thinking about how to beat George Gordon Meade in the Army of the Potomac.
Ultimately, Stuart gets on the field. We touched on a little bit about his absence. Since July 3rd is kind of his day to go into action at East Cavalry Field, I'll back up for a minute. How much do you think ultimately Stuart's absence hurt Lee at Gettysburg?
Yeah, so I think mostly it is almost as if the entire cavalry of the Army of Northern Virginia is wrapped up in one person. And we think about this, today we talk about that we're swimming in sensors and drowning in data. If you think about 10,000 cavalry guys riding around a Civil War field or region, they're all sending back notes, and it's Jeb Stuart who goes like, nah, that's not that important. That's not important. Oh, that one's important. He's the guy who takes raw data and turns it into intelligence. And when he does that, Lee wins. And when that guy isn't there, that's when things start to fall apart.
Okay. All right. And so that's going to, some have termed the July 3rd fight combined operation, infantry, artillery, cavalry. I don't personally believe Stuart's role at East Cavalry Field is coordinated with Pickett's charge. I don't think many serious Gettysburg historians do. But from the point of, because you touched on this earlier, Lee's ability to coordinate an attack along his lines. You want to talk just a little bit about the debacle of Pickett's charge and what goes wrong on July 3rd for Lee's army?
Yeah, so I mean, there are multiple problems here, and even a lot of the authors that we go back to as kind of being, the guys on this, whether that's, you know, Fonz over on Culp's Hill saying, "Hey, those guys attacking up Culp's Hill, their ammunition is a mile away for the Confederates.
Yeah.
Surely they have a system to get ammunition." Well, yeah, they should. And there should be a division level system and a corps level system too. So that breaks down. The choice for units in Pickett's charge. Douglas Southall Freeman, as close as he gets to, slays Lee for his choice of units in Pickett's charge. Because if we look at this, gets to, we talk about you should know the enemy, know ourselves, know the environment. Arguably, Lee knows the least about himself.
Mhm.
Otherwise, he would have picked other units, or what should have happened was AP Hill should have known and he should have spoken up and he would have put one unit in place for another. But that doesn't happen. And I would consider that to be a breakdown of staff work.
How about on the Army of the Potomac side? We already touched on the so-called Hancock Hunt controversy, but what else is going on over at headquarters over there that you would attribute presumably to good staff work?
Well, so the biggest one is think about the collection of Union wounded. Like here's, as the last shots die out, we do have a good account of the Fifth Corps chief of ambulance staff position. So he talks about they recover 1,300 bodies with 81 ambulances between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 4 o'clock in the morning. 1,300 people. That's crazy. That isn't staying out in the field for 2 weeks post Bull Run, and it's certainly not 24 hours at Antietam. This tells you how high functioning the medical department of the Army of the Potomac is under Jonathan Letterman, who is a rock star of all rock star staff officers.
What about Seth Williams? Now, you've touched on him, you've mentioned him a couple of times, and I probably should have asked you this earlier, but just for the sake of it, because it's a name that comes up, what is Seth Williams' role in the Army of the Potomac?
So he's an adjutant general. I think he becomes an adjutant general in 1850.
Mhm.
He's Lee's adjutant general when he's a superintendent at West Point. So he's been this a while. Effectively, this is the administrative arm of the Army of the Potomac. They generate orders, circulars, and make sure that they get disseminated. That is his principal responsibility, and he's good at it because he's one of the first staff officers in the Army of the Potomac because he comes with George B. McClellan.
So, related to that, the administrative aspect of the Army of the Potomac, headquarters is disrupted during the cannonade preceding Pickett's charge. And as we know, Meade for a time is out of contact with the Army. He's going to Powers Hill and then he's coming back and that sort of thing. Do we see any significant part that his absence plays during the defense of Cemetery Ridge? Or by that time, do you have all the chess pieces set up so well that it just, can manage
Yeah,
itself, for lack of a better word?
boy, I like this question because there's a lot of like what could have been done to make that a
Yeah.
little better. Signal Corps is relatively new. It's really just started in March. It's hit or miss on how ability. And when Meade goes over to Powers Hill, you realize he can't talk to anybody back at his headquarters. So he's like, well, this was a colossal waste of time. And that's when he rides back. But he has almost nobody with him, right? He runs into his son on the way back. So presumably that means everybody is out running around. And if you do the math, I came up with like 20, it's just under 25% of the brigades of the Army of the Potomac are heading to the Union Center during the bombardment. So we often, we do the fight at the angle and we talk about, the 19th and the Massachusetts and the 42nd New York, man. everybody and their brothers headed that way. Now, I'm not saying it's 24% of the Army of the Potomac, because a lot of these are units that got First Corps units that got wore out and that kind of thing.
Right,
But
Third
there's a
Corps.
lot
Yeah.
of the Army of the Potomac on the move. And I would argue one of the reasons, I presume, one of the reasons Meade doesn't have a lot of people with him is because they are out and about.
And that's something I've debated with people in the past. Are these guys rushing in towards the center and towards the copse of trees because that's where the action is, so to speak, or is it a coordinated effort by George Meade? Because I'll sometimes hear people use the phrase Meade sends in 20,000 reinforcements. That's a very specific phrase. Do we have any evidence that Meade is directly sending those guys in, or is it just kind of a huzzah, there's the enemy, let's go? What do you
Yeah, it's
think?
a good question. So when I say I'm making an inference that he doesn't have anybody with him. Now, granted, some of them are back at his headquarters because he leaves them there. But I presume that the others are out and they're on the move. I don't know necessarily that they're all, uh, in headlong rush to the angle, but
Yeah.
I do think that they are moving from the south north, and they are moving from behind Cemetery Hill closer to the position, because that's where the bombardment's been landing. Like at this point they go like, oh, that's going to be a thing. So I connect some dots in there. I think nobody can be specific about numbers in the move, and it really depends on how wide of a circle you draw around that to
Yeah,
say how many
right.
people are really headed that
Yeah,
way, or are
what's
they
your
just in
zone?
position. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, yeah, no, fair enough. So Meade comes back. Pickett's charge has been repulsed. Meade starts heading out towards Little Round Top to decide what he's going to do next. What role does staff play, good or bad, in
Yeah.
this reconnaissance and force after the charge?
So if we think about it, like we always talk about the Council War on July 2nd, but I would argue, right, we really have four. We have the one on the evening of July 1st up at Cemetery Hill. It's all the people that are there. That's the best advice he can get. And again, establish common operational picture. Here's our intent. When he meets with Sedgwick, Sykes, Pleasanton down there, those are all the players that can make a difference on that end of the field. He can't, presumably, the theory of the day is we should counterattack back across Pickett's chart. Well, the Second Corps is in no condition whatsoever to do that. The next closest punch he can throw is the Fifth and Sixth Corps down around the wheat field. So I think he's trying to have that conversation. Now, part of this is we decided yesterday night that we were going to be on the defensive on the ground that we
Mhm.
already held. So
Yeah.
the idea that now all of a sudden a lot of command is about how well we manage transitions, and to transition from full on defensive, hang on, to, hey, now we're going to launch a counterattack. Oh, by the way, against Confederates that were not part of that attack, so still have ammunition and all that. I think people often expect too much out of that. I appreciate that he went down there, though, to try and see what his options are, which is what a commander should do.
Okay, all right. And how about on that part of the field, cavalry? So we have Farnsworth's charge at the end. You can argue there is an attempt there to coordinate infantry and cavalry, but of course it falls apart and you have a very uncoordinated effort. Again, staff work.
Yeah, so I mean, I am loath to give Kilpatrick credit, and I hate the idea that Farnsworth is going to get killed down there. However, if you are going to launch a counterattack, what can you use to set the preconditions for success? And using cavalry to extend what was, well, now it's Evander Law's division, but to extend them and force them to go further to the south and to the west is creating conditions that if you could get the 5th and 6th Corps together, then that would give you a better opportunity of it is coordination, whether we like how it's pulled off or not. It's still coordination.
And then summing up maybe on the retreat, and the retreat we could do as a whole separate episode. So maybe,
Yeah.
Doug, I'm going to get you back to do a separate episode on the retreat. But I guess so, Jordan, sort of just as a nickel summary here, both Army of Potomac, Army of Northern Virginia on the retreat. Any staff examples that you kind of want to highlight, good or bad?
Yeah, I think one of the things that happened is the margins at Gettysburg get so tight that now staff work really does matter. Once the armies start to move again, then I think kind of the ad hocery of the Army of Northern Virginia is allowed to flourish. We got Major Harmon building pontoon bridges. Hang on, Major Harmon is the quartermaster.
Okay.
Why is he building a pontoon bridge? Like, that's nuts. Now, granted, he's one of those guys that gets things done, and I get it. But like, Lee has engineers and they are helping him. But ultimately, if we were to read some of the accounts, they say Harmon's responsible for this. But having a guy responsible for wagons build a pontoon bridge seems nuts to me. But it is how the Army of Potomac is capable. It gives a massive flexibility, even though that comes with a distinct lack of structure and process that we can count on when the margins are tight.
Okay. All right.
And then the Army of the Potomac, well, they do what they always do, right? By the time they go back through Frederick, they'll be materially entirely ready to fight the battle over again, right? They'll replace every round of ammunition that they fired. The medical department leaves 106 surgeons behind. They request 50 more, 47 show up. And even as they leave Frederick, Letterman will say, the medical department is ready to fight another Battle of Gettysburg sized battle all over again.
Mm.
That is remarkable in less than a week. That tells you how professional the staff work is. Now, the Army of the Potomac, its fighting forces and its leadership are not ready to fight another Battle of Gettysburg again. But for the material things that staff work can provide, they're in place.
Okay.
It's pretty impressive.
A recent book or two have sort of portrayed the Army of the Potomac as being this bedraggled, shoeless, half naked, starving body of men coming out of Gettysburg. Do you buy that? Or again, to your point, is the staff so good that they can change that over in a week?
Well, so I do agree with the account, but it's only because once I think, again, this is one of those things we lose sight of. Once we start to move an army, you can't graze your horses long enough. And while we talk about 10 pounds of oats and 13 pounds of hay and all that other stuff, they're not getting that every day. So effectively, you're burning that horse, right? You're burning, today we would say that you're burning readiness. You're using readiness. So unless you're willing to give that horse 8 hours a day to go ahead and graze and supplement it, it means that horse is slowly dying.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've paid that in order to get up to Gettysburg as rapidly as possible to fight Robert E. Lee. So yes, they are worn out. And everybody talks about it. Even the march south is as harder as the mud march was. But the idea that, Ingalls requests nearly 50,000 shoes, they're leaning into this. And if you think about the guys in Washington, D.C. that are gathering horses from Pennsylvania, their ability to replace this is crazy remarkable.
Gettysburg campaign, MVP. Who do you think is either army? I would guess you're going to pick Army of the Potomac, but I'll leave that to you. MVP of staff work. Pick one guy.
One guy. Henry Hunt's everywhere, man.
Yeah, okay.
And I'm going to put him in there mostly because he gets operationalized too, so he does have a role in the fighting. But I mean, he's not at the Council of War on Tuesday. He's not at Council of War after the second day. He's helping distribute 70,000 rounds of ammunition. Good staff work. He talks to every battery. Wouldn't you want the best artillerists in the American Civil War to talk to every battery commander before the largest Confederate bombardment of the Civil War? That guy's a stud, and he has one aide, Lieutenant Bissell, and that kid's also a stud. Nobody knows his name, but he must have been pretty awesome to keep up with him the whole time.
All right. Well, we'll do a whole episode on Bissell for you. How about that?
Perfect.
All right. So changing gears then, as we move away from Gettysburg, the Civil War, into the 21st century, this could have been a question I could have asked at the beginning. I'm going to ask it at the end instead. Frequently encounter people on the battlefield, typically modern military veterans of the 21st or the late 20th century wars, who sometimes assume modern staff work equates historically to how the staffs worked in the Civil War. Ultimately, what's the big commonality between what exists today and maybe what's the biggest difference or two?
So staffs back then still do what they do today in the sense of they take mundane tasks off the commander's plate. They provide expertise that the commander doesn't have. They take care and provide extra, and they become extensions of the commander, eyes, ears, legs, mind, providing ideas, even to inform and advance the commander's thinking so they can do a job better. That's what staffs did back then. That's what they do today. The dilemma is we've never had a field army staff until the American Civil War. I mean, Winfield Scott has 14,000 guys down in Mexico. That's not even the size of a corps. So we've never moved this many people. The idea that we have army staffs for the first time is they're all learning this anew. This is all brand new, and they have a bureau system at the top, which we came up with during the Revolution. So they are taking structure that existed before, but they are expanding it in ways that were never imagined. So in that sense, we don't have the modern staff the way we do today. And that's why I think one of the reasons I've gotten into it is the average I think hand wave says staff work was terrible in the Civil War, and only except for the quartermaster work in the Eastern Theater in 1864 and 5 does it actually. And that is pure bunk, man. We're moving hundreds of thousands of men across hundreds of miles, and we're fighting major campaigns. The staff work is actually pretty remarkable.
When are you going to put this in your book? How's that coming along?
I reached out. Funny, I just got a good email back. So now I've got some people that say, hey, they're interested in looking at it. Now I've got to take it from the pure geekery of an academic dissertation. Nobody wants to read 30 pages of literature review and put it into a format that somebody might want to publish. But I'd like to.
Well, Doug, I can't talk about the academic world as much, but I can guarantee you have a ton of fans in the Civil War community who would love to read and will read anything you put out. So, hell, man, copy the phone book and put your name on it, and people will read that because you have a lot of fans out there, and it's well deserved.
That's kind. I really appreciate it.
Any closing thoughts? Anything I forgot to ask you that you wanted to talk about that I just neglected? I mean, I could think of a million things I didn't cover, but
And what I would really think is when the margins get so close to Gettysburg, it really, I mean, I have made the case that we often talk in every other battle up to this point, when it gets to an inflection point, it bends the Confederate way. At Gettysburg, it tends to bend the Union way. And in part of that bending the Union way, I think is good staff work. Even just the idea of every time, we think about Union soldiers arrive with 5 minutes to spare. I think that 5 minutes started when they build 200, two 1,250-foot pontoon bridges across the Potomac River, which would be the engineering brigade, which is also staff work. So they've come up and put these things all together. And what you've done is kind of aggregated these marginal gains across time, and that translates to victory.
Yeah, okay. That brings up another question. Hey folks, it's our YouTube. We can keep this going as long as we want, right? As you know, Chris Army and I have been doing stuff with the Overland campaign recently, some tours down in Virginia, that sort of thing. That inflection point that you talked about from a staffing perspective, does a lot of the things we talked about here with Gettysburg continue in 1864 and 65? Does anything get better in the Army of Northern Virginia or change for the better or worse with Grant kind of coming into the Army of the Potomac?
So the answer is they both get better. Lee's staff does get better because they've
Okay.
asked to do more over time. They can't help but. But the Army of the Potomac staff just becomes more and more robust. Their ability to change their base of supply as it moves from Culpeper over to Aquia Station and then across the James and City Point. And you can see how good Army of the Potomac staff officers because Grant basically pulls Seth Williams onto his staff. He makes Rufus Ingalls the quartermaster for the larger effort, what is really an Army group at that point when the Army of the James and the Army of the Potomac get together. So these guys are so good, you can see it pulling up at that level, and that now they're all thinking this way, and that the training we think about, like Rufus Ingalls talks about, this training goes all the way down through the Army. Not only is he a good quartermaster, but he's trained good corps quartermasters and division quartermasters and brigade quartermasters. So when they say get the trains out of the way so that we can move, they move. I think all of it gets better. And this is where we kind of get the idea of the Army of the Potomac's on a trajectory that's on the rise. And I would say the Army of Northern Virginia is on a falling trajectory. And that crossover really happens at Gettysburg. And it'll continue to the end of the war.
Perfect summary and close. Is that how you ended your dissertation? Because that was perfect, man, right?
Thanks.
All right, Doug Douds, U.S. Army War College, licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg. My friend, thank you so much for joining the Battle of Gettysburg podcast. We could go on for 6 hours, but YouTube tells us people don't like videos more than 30 or 60 minutes. So,
I'm
but,
on
I, but
board,
I'm,
man.
I'm sure everybody would still watch. Would love to have you back and do more stuff. Hopefully we can make this happen again. So thanks a lot for the time.
Thank you so much, Jim. I already look forward to it.
Thanks, Doug. And thank you all for watching, by the way.